The War for Independence is a seminal event in history, and this screencast is designed to provide an overview of how the American colonies started off as a group of isolated settlements and merged into a group of semi-united people who challenged the power and authority of one of the world's most prominent nations. So the American colonies were settled in the early 1600s. While people from different countries settled, as time passed, the American colonies imitated English institutions and culture. People saw England as a ruling power, and local governments that emerged recognized the power of the crown. In the next 120 years, these settlements emerged from small encampments to flourishing cities. Regional differences emerged as crops such as tobacco and indigo became important in the economies of the southern colonies, and shipbuilding, timber, and trade defined the northern colonies. The dominant economic system of the time was mercantilism. The argument for mercantilism was that colonies existed to support the mother country. So, strong countries needed natural resources beyond what existed beyond their boundaries. And so colonization was a necessity, and all of the European nations were in a big race for colonization. In the 1600s, the American colonies provided raw materials such as timber and indigo and tobacco to England, where those products were sold and manufactured. In return, the American colonists sold their goods at competitive rates in larger markets. So the navigation acts were an outgrowth of the mercantilist system. England was in constant competition with other European countries such as the French and the Dutch, so Parliament passed laws that would basically protect their investments in the colonies. There were a series of regulations about how goods could be shipped, for example, which ships, which ports, and which goods would be taxed based on where they were being either imported or exported. England wanted to make sure that manufacturing didn't emerge in the colonies, because if the colonists could produce and process their own raw materials, they wouldn't need the mother country, England. So the colonists did benefit from this arrangement because they always had a market for their goods. However, there were some that found these regulations a hindrance to their business, so smuggling became a regular part of economic life. For the most part, England ignored this because on the whole they were still profiting from the system as it was set up. So, things began changing with the beginning of the French and the Indian War. The French and Indian War was a result of tensions that had been started somewhere else and spilled over into the New World. This was a war for territory. France wanted to expand its influence from Canada into the Appalachians, and England saw this as a threat to their colonies. So the American colonists fought for England because they considered themselves English colonists, but during the conflict many of them began to see cultural and social differences between themselves and the British soldiers who came from England to fight. So the war ended in 1763 with the defeat of the French. They surrendered and signed a treaty where they basically agreed to leave North America. So the entire East Coast and parts of Canada became British North America. Around the same time, Indian rebellions erupted on the borders of settled territory in reaction to settlers and some of the residual conflicts from the war. The British government didn't want to continue dealing with conflict as they had incurred a huge debt from the war with the French, so they came up with a solution of drawing an imaginary line that would act as a barrier to settlement. Some of the colonists who had fought in the war had assumed they would be able to move west after they had served with the army and start anew with their own farms and their own land. So tensions emerged, and the Proclamation Line of 1763 started a chain of events. So in order to pay for the war with France and for the troops that would be housed in the colonies to enforce the Proclamation Line, the British issued a series of taxes. And each tax was met with disbelief and eventually anger. The British saw taxation as logical because the colonists were British citizens who needed to pay their fair share, and the colonies thought the policies were unreasonable and unfair. Things came to a head with the Boston Massacre, where British troops had been housed in Boston to enforce the Navigation Acts and to ensure that the taxation was being carried out, and eventually people started yelling at each other and fighting, and within a few minutes the skirmish led to a cadre of British troops firing into a crowd of people and killing them. So the crux of the army around taxation really was this, and after the Boston Massacre, people started really debating this. So, did England have the right to tax the colonies? And the colonists said no, because they had no direct representation in Parliament, and they were therefore forced to be taxed without any voice in their governance. They had also enjoyed a period of time when none of the laws that England had passed had really been enforced, and they'd been able to do what they want. And so they didn't really understand why England was suddenly coming down on them and making them pay all these taxes. So the counterclaim to this argument was yes, as subjects of the king, American colonists needed to pay taxes like any other British subject. English subjects did not have a direct say in who represented them because Parliament acted as a democratic body that indirectly represented everyone, so not all English citizens were directly electing their parliamentary representation. And people thought, well, why would it happen in America if it's not even happening in England? So England felt like they had every right to tax and to get their fair share to keep the government in the colonies above water. Things did not settle down. In fact, they got even worse. After Parliament passed a tax on tea, colonists looked at this as something that was just totally intolerable, and so they dressed up like Native Americans, went onto the boats where the tea was being imported, and dumped all of the boxes into Boston Harbor. By this time, the British government had pretty much had it, and so they passed a series of acts that were called the Coercive Acts, and this was when they really started heavy-handing the situation. So the first thing they did was they closed Boston Harbor, which was a huge area of trade, and so closing this down basically hindered all of the trade in New England. All of the positions in the Massachusetts government would be appointed by Parliament, so people were losing their rights to vote for people to represent their interests. People who'd been accused, in terms of if they were royal officials, all of their trials would be moved to England. And the Quartering Act was passed where British troops were stationed in Boston to keep the peace, and they could be housed in whatever building that was available. So basically, troops could be moving into someone's house, and they would be there to enforce a series of laws that nobody wanted in the first place. So this is when people started really having some debates about should the American colonists continue to try to work things out with England, or was there a slight chance that they might be able to do things on their own? So Massachusetts had a pretty strong feeling about it because they were basically living under martial law. But many of the southern colonies were reluctant to break with England because they depended on English markets for their crops. So a group of people representing various colonies, not all of them, met at the First Continental Congress, and they had this debate about what they should do. Should they stay with England, or should they set out on their own for independence? And at this time, it was about 50-50. And then things became more violent, and there was an actual conflict with the Battle of Lexington and Concord, where British troops fired on the Patriots. And so this was a tipping point for a lot of people, because to this point they thought that England would still handle things fairly nicely and fairly fairly. But once people saw that British troops were being marched into these towns in Massachusetts and shooting at people, regardless if they were being provoked or was part of a battle, people started seeing themselves as not part of the English Empire and more independent people. The other thing that started to really turn the tide was a pamphlet that was written by a gentleman named Patrick Henry, who was from Virginia, and he wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense, and he was clearly influenced by the Enlightenment. What he said in this book was basically, a government of our own is natural. It's a natural right, pulling from Enlightenment thinking. And he said, "'Tis time to part." And Common Sense was one of the most widely read pamphlets in the colonies during this time period. By the time people had read Common Sense, after Lexington and Concord and all of those other events, the group of people that had initially met at the First Continental Congress reconvened at the Second Continental Congress, and this is where events began to turn. They decided to elect George Washington to be the commander of the army, and they decided to draft a Declaration of Independence that would be eventually written by Thomas Jefferson, and they formally agreed to make that break with England.